By the Jews, he released him from his bonds and commanded the chief priests and all their council to appear and brought Paul down and set before them. Then Paul, looking earnestly at the council, said, Men, brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. For you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command to me to be struck contrary to the law? And those who stood by said, Do you revile God's high priest? Then Paul said, I did not know, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. But when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am being judged. And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For Sadducees say there is no resurrection and no angel or spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. Then there arose a loud outcry, and the scribes of the Pharisees' party arose and protested, saying, We find no evil in this man. But if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God. Now when there arose a great dissension, the commander, fearing lest Paul might be pulled to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down, take him by force from among them, and bring him into the barracks. So you get this really, again, just colorful scene that happens here. And the first thing that happens is, so Paul, ignore that. You're not even supposed to see that yet, so don't look at this. I messed up. So Paul, when he throws in, the first thing that he says, much like if in our courts today, are you allowed to speak on your own behalf? Of course. So Paul says, and he makes this claim, and he says, I've lived in all good conscience before God today. And what is the immediate presumption on the part of Ananias? What is he doing? It was, in essence, what is he saying?
He really has him struck on the mouth.
Because why?
Because he said it's a lie. He thinks it's a lie.
Shut up, you're guilty. Right? Is that not exactly what he's... You're not allowed to say that. We all know you're guilty. We're just here to determine the veracity of how much guilt you have. So strike him on the mouth. Now, is that according to the law? Obviously not. What were they there supposed to be doing? What should they be there? If this was a righteous and true court, what should they be there to do?
Reviewing the testimony.
Right. Gather witnesses. Determine the veracity of the charges against Paul. Determine what the charges even are. But of course Ananias does this. Now, what do we know about Ananias? So this is Ananias, the same Ananias from previous in Scripture. And what do we know about him? What do we generally know about him? Does anybody have any idea? So Ananias is the father-in-law of Caiaphas. And he's known as being an extremely violent and insolent man. And this is a quote that's given from Josephus. Ananias was a bold man in his temper and very insolent. He was also of the sect of the Sadducees, which is a body that is very rigid in their exercise of power. And so this man is the picture, is the typical of corruption at the heart of Jewish society and at the heart of Jewish leadership. And Josephus here points it out. And he calls him a whitewashed wall, which is to say what? When Paul says he's a whitewashed wall, it means what?
Probably a liar.
Okay, he's a liar, but what is the concept of being a whitewashed wall? And where, we've heard that kind of terminology before. So what is it? What is he really saying about it?
It looks good on the outside, but not on the inside.
Yeah, just 1,000 people nailed it right there. Lori said, he looks good on the outside, but on the inside, he's full of decay. It's something, there's something there, there's something that's rotting away, there's something that's bad at its core. If you have a wall, like, if you've got a wall that's got water damage, or you've got some other kind of issue, and you want to kind of just paste over it, that's what this looks like. There's something rotten at the core of what's going on here. And Ananias, the high priest, the center of Jewish power, is a whitewashed wall. There's something decayed that's being papered over here. Now, either because he doesn't have his vestments, I'm not exactly sure what's going on. Obviously, in a normal Sanhedrin setting, Paul would know who Ananias was, but in this particular case, he says he doesn't either because he's not wearing his vestments, or perhaps, and I think this is an interesting commentary, because of what he does here, his conduct is so out of line with what the high priest would normally be, that obviously he recants on that, and he even quotes from Exodus 22:28. So when the high priest is not acting lawful, Paul has respect for the law in verse 5. But Paul, of course, has been in these scenarios lots of times before, right? I mean, Paul's very familiar. You know, he grew up, and he's about to say, he says of himself what? What is he? What was he? Think back to the very beginning. What was Saul of Tarsus? And not just he's not just like the sixth guy off the bench Pharisee, right? He's not just like an added piece. What kind of Pharisee was he?
Pharisee of Pharisees.
He was the guy. He was the most Pharisee, right? He excelled beyond all his peers in his attainment under the law and under that society. And so he's a Pharisee of Pharisees. And so he says in verse 6, "Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am being judged." Now we're going to come back to that in a second, because he says that, and the people in the room hear that, but the way they hear it, we're going to talk about in just a second. But then Luke goes on to add this explanatory note about Pharisees and Sadducees, and he obviously does this for his Gentile audience and for the readers to kind of explain, hey, if you didn't know, this is what's going on behind the scenes. This is what's really actually happening. Now you can actually pay attention to this. Okay, now I'm here. So there are tremendous differences between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And I'll go ahead and tell you, most of what we know about the Sadducees, we learned from their opposition. So there are no surviving commentaries of the Sadducees. The Sadducees went the way of the dodo shortly after AD 70. And there's a good reason for that. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. But the Pharisees, they believed in the oral traditions and the oral law. And by the way, that's the thing that Jesus most often was battering against them, that they held so strictly to this oral law. In addition, and this oral law was an additional, they viewed it as that was not only interpretive, but it was equally judicial in rank to the written law, and it helped determine various things like Sabbath regulations and dietary regulations and that kind of thing. The Sadducees did not give any credence to the oral law, and instead they solely focused on the Torah and the Tanakh. So the Old Testament Bible is primarily their only instruction. And the Pharisees believed in angelic messengers, the messengers of the Bible, that someone might receive a spiritual visit, that someone might be visited by a spirit or by a ghost or by an angel, and the Sadducees did not. Now, again, one might point out and say, well, there are clearly angels. The way Luke puts it, you might read and say, well, the Sadducees don't believe in angels. Well, that would be problematic, because where are angels? Well, they're littered all over the very text that they claim to believe. However, I think a little bit of this has to be interpreted in what exactly Paul is saying. They don't believe that folks would arise from the dead, and that goes into the no resurrection piece of it, and that no one would come and visit or be an angel or be a messenger from God at that time to speak to them. Interestingly enough, and this is also by the Pharisees, and this is ironically a debate that has gone on now, for well over a few thousand years. So the relative sovereignty of God, as well as the role that free will plays in man, is something that was even going on in that day and time. And so the Pharisees believed in a balance between the free will of man and the sovereignty of God. And then the Sadducees were on the complete kind of divine determinism, and that's what they believed. And the Pharisees were very big on the purity laws and ritual purity, and the Sadducees were very much big on the temple service, because the entirety to them, where was their base of power? Their base of power was in Jerusalem. Like we read about Pharisees in other places, but the Sadducees are primarily interested in what's happening to the temple. And that's one of the reasons we don't have a lot of Sadducee information, is because when AD 70 comes around, the Sadducees' entire way of living, the entire thing that made them who they were, that's gone. So now most all that's left is from the Pharisees. Now, I want to circle back to the scribe's comment. So they hear what Paul says in verse 6. And this is what they say in verse 9. We find no evil in this man, but if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God. So, interestingly enough, where have we heard something very similar to that before? Gamaliel. Because Gamaliel was a Pharisee. And actually, we have to kind of make a little bit of a turn here. So in the Gospels, the primary antagonist to Jesus is the Pharisees. But actually, in the book of Acts, there are a great number of Pharisees who end up turning to the faith. And the Pharisees actually are kind of painted in a little more favorable light than the Sadducees are, because the exact reasoning that Gamaliel gave several decades ago that we talked about earlier in this class, here's his ideological adherents saying that basically the exact same thing several years later. Now, what's interesting about that is they say that, but these folks, I don't think they really feel that, obviously. Because what's been happening for the past couple decades, clearly the way is not going away and they continue to see the work of the Spirit. How do you interpret what the scribes heard Paul to say? If you read that, what do you interpret? What do you think they heard Paul to say? Do you think they heard Paul to say, Jesus is the risen Savior and you should all come to believe in him?
Well, I believe in our proposition that there is a resurrection.
Yeah, I believe in our proposition that there is a resurrection, and yeah, it's possible that Paul might have heard from a spirit, from an angel, something like that, and he may be a little confused about what he heard, but we at least believe and give adherence to the fact that it could have happened. The Sadducees are saying, that's entirely out of bounds. That couldn't possibly have happened. Now, they're not going whole hog into Jesus is the risen Lord, but they're at least giving the possibility of that. And again, at that point, what happens? I think we think about, let's delve for a second here into risky territory. So, we think it's bad, right now between Democrats and Republicans, right? We think it's bad, generally. Imagine that they also had their own theologies, and that their theologies, and not just a political conversation, but down to a religious conversation, down to a theological conversation. They even had their own sports teams, okay? Like it's Auburn, Alabama, it's UK, Tennessee, it's Florida, wherever you are. It's that down to your core. That's where it was. In fact, so much so that the history between these two groups is such that routinely, over the past couple hundred years, so-and-so was crucifying so-and-so over there. There's a point in which 800 Pharisees are crucified directly because of something the Sadducees had done. Not long, a few hundred years before this. And so what does the meaning evolve down into? This is a judicial, can you imagine? I'm trying to think of something that would be equivalent to this. There's the story, I remember in AP US history where, and I don't remember, I should have looked this up before I came in here. There was a point in which an older senator came and beat another guy with a cane on the floor of the US Senate. And that happened, I think, in the 1800s or something like that. What does this devolve into? What is the commander afraid of in verse 10?
Sectarian violence.
Sectarian violence in the very place, in the place where judgment is supposed to be. So much so that the commander is afraid that Paul is going to be ripped to pieces in the process. It's just one of these colorful moments that Luke throws in here that really shows you how bad this is. Now, let's cycle back around. This is what I want to spend a few minutes on. You're Paul. You've just been through all this. Now, you've been through this a lot before. This time feels a little different. And at the end of the day, you got to go back to the Roman barracks. And I really want to spend a few minutes. What do you think? We just cut off at verse 10 on purpose. I cut off right there on purpose. I know verse 11 is coming. We're going to talk about that. At the end of verse 10, put yourself in Paul's shoes for just a moment. What do you think Paul's thinking as he's sitting there that night in a Roman barracks, reviewing the events of the past few days? What do you think he's thinking?
I sort of think even in the way he pitted them against each other, it does feel like he finally gave up hope for, we talked about why he was so desperate to get to Jerusalem because of his love for his Jewish brethren, his hope to, through this gift and through his teaching, finally maybe bring some. I feel like he's finally said, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, Josh. I feel like he's given up some hope. And I'm going to come back. One of the things, just to go on that, I'll give them right to you, Floyd. One of the things on that, before we got into this class, the way that I think about Paul, the way I think we're all tempted to think about Paul is that he's like this unstoppable juggernaut, right? That like he's just like doctor, bam, 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 next city, next city, next city. And when we come to the book of Acts and we read the accompanying letters and you look at his life, the man had some serious ups and downs. And it's not the first thing that we think about, but I agree with your interpretation. Floyd?
Some of the things that Luke seems to be bringing out is that this problem with the Jews and their disregard for the law is it's a top-down problem. Even the high priest himself is endorsing criminal behavior, and it's abundantly clear Paul isn't going to get a fair trial, so his best hope is to change the focus, and it's easy to do in this environment.
Right. So Paul recognizes, and think about how, again, disheartening that would be for Paul to know that the people, and I guess this wouldn't be a surprise to him because he was involved, but it's still just probably crushing to think that the people at the very top are not going to give me a fair trial. And these are, as we've said multiple times, what does he say about these? Ethan, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I think it's also, after you set the scene so well of how much these two groups hated each other, when was the last time they were unified on anything? And that was getting rid of Jesus.
Right.
So you can see that even with the attempts of him perceiving the group dynamics and doing everything, it still ends with evil and destruction, and you got to think that's going to get turned to him as the easiest solution.
As the easiest target. Just as it will, I'm glad you brought that up. Just as it will, when Theophilus is reading this, it's not many years before the Roman government is going to come to the exact same conclusion that Ethan just said. And so if you're reading this as a Gentile, who's the easiest target to blame this on? The Christians. And when you're holding the book of Acts and you're reading it as a Gentile and you see this coming and you can look back to an incident like this and say, aha, we're being scapegoated. We're not criminals. I think that's a powerful testimony to Theophilus and everybody else who's holding this book. What else might you be thinking? Some of these things I've already brought, some of these exact things you brought up. Again, rejected by his own countrymen whom he loved. He's sitting in the jail and he's thinking, these are the people that I was so desperate to get back to. And look what happened to me. What else might he be thinking? Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, I think it's interesting that as he gets into this situation, we see once again that he's a survivor on a mission. Just a few chapters before, they're beating him and he's like, hey, are you allowed to do this to a Roman citizen? He pulls out these cards where he sees an opportunity to continue on his mission. And I think that this is no different. When he sees, it says when he perceived who was there. And we're getting this picture, if we zoom out a little bit, we're getting this picture of how significant the changes had been from what God had given these people in the Old Testament. Look what the high priest has become.
Yeah.
You mentioned Caiaphas. What did he say? He's the one who said, wouldn't it be fine for one man to die? So that, he was on board with the plot to kill one of the fellow Jews so that they could remain in power. And here we have another high priest. He's the high priest. Right. The person who's supposed to do the sacrifices. The person, so it's become so political that it's just completely evil people doing it. And so I look at it as Paul is actually seeing this as he is trying to keep going.
Right.
And he pits them against each other on purpose because he
Oh, for
sees,
sure.
here's a way out of this room.
Yeah.
Like, here's a way, I just need to get to the next, like, here's a way for me to escape from right here.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I completely agree with, and I think that's what it is. But I also wonder, in that thought, you might think I'm making no progress here. I can't. If we can't get these people on the same page, how in the world am I going to move the ball? It's much like Jeremiah, right? Jeremiah, how many years has he spent beating his head against the rock for his own people, and he's making no progress? The other thing that Josh brought up a second ago is, I would think about how much time, energy, and effort went around into this last mission journey, getting a bunch of money, getting a bunch of people, taking that money to Jerusalem to people who truly needed it. And do we ever get a sense, and I'm not saying that it wasn't, but we don't really get the sense that it accomplished the thing that Paul primarily wanted it to do. Now, the pertinent thing is that people needed help in Jerusalem. People needed real financial help in Jerusalem. But what had Paul really hoped was going to happen in conjunction with that? What was the real thing there?
Unification between the two groups.
Unification. And at every turn, what's the thing that's the furthest away? Unification. It's like the goalpost just keeps getting moved and keeps getting moved and keeps getting moved. It seems to just get further away. And the more effort he spends, the more sacrifice that happened. And I put a passage up there from Romans chapter 15, verse 31, where Paul's writing before he even comes to Jerusalem. He's writing about how he hopes that the Jerusalem brethren will accept this gift. He's grand hopes about what's going to happen. And it just doesn't happen. And so I have to sit there and think that he's sitting there potentially thinking, I have failed in my efforts to not only unify Jew and Gentile, but I have failed in my ability to even unify my own people behind the person of Jesus.
And just one kind of sidebar.
Yeah.
There is one sense where he made it a little bit tougher on himself.
Yeah.
With the comment that he made.
Yeah.
And nice, but in all of that, I would venture to say that everybody in this room, when you were confronted with, that's the high priest, we would have said, so what, he's not acting like it.
Right.
But he realized he was wrong, and he immediately corrected himself.
Absolutely. And
That's character.
it really is. And I'm glad you brought that up. You're right. He didn't help himself, but I think we can all feel when it's the height of hypocrisy that's literally slapping you in the face. Like, we talk about hypocrisy slapping you in the face. This is literally where hypocrisy is slapping Paul in the face. And but he turns on a dime, does he not, to your point? Yeah, John.
Two comments about that with Paul, because I've always wondered how in the world did Paul make this kind of a statement against the high priest? But you think about two things. Number one, Claudius had called this Sanhedrin sort of out of order. They met hurriedly, and maybe he was not in his vestments. He wasn't dressed up like the high priest, and Paul didn't recognize him by his face. Number two, we talk about Paul's thorn in the flesh that he talks about in Corinthians, and in Galatians he says, I came to you with an ailment, and you would have torn out your eyes.
Right.
So he gives the idea that maybe he had some vision problems. So maybe he just didn't even see that he was him physically.
Right.
I can give him some grace
See
on
how
that
that
a
would
little
happen
bit.
in that room. Absolutely.
A second point is in thinking about his now feeling like he's reached the end of the road in Jerusalem. If you go back and look at Peter's imprisonment in Acts 12, it says the church earnestly prayed for Peter while he was in jail. It makes that specific mention. And all through this with Paul, there's never a comment made that the church earnestly prayed for Paul. And you get the feeling that he didn't feel like he was in the brotherhood as strongly as he didn't feel like he had the backing perhaps amongst the Jerusalem brethren as well.
And I think James kind of said, that's kind of that's kind of why he's here. Is, because he doesn't appear to have the back, the church in Jerusalem does not have his back. And not only that, We know that some of the churches that he had worked with, they don't have his back. So, just if you're sitting there and you're thinking about the culmination of your life, the other things that I've got to be thinking is I'm never going to get to Rome. I wrote to these people. I said, I'm looking forward to coming to you that I might share in the blessings of spreading the gospel in Rome. And Paul's sitting there, he's thinking, I'm never going to get there. I wrote it. It's not going to happen. I should have just listened to all the prophets who told me not to do this. How many times in various places in the chapters leading up to this did somebody say, okay, but if you go, this is what's going to happen? And I can't help but think, just from a human standpoint, when you're sitting there in those barracks, if you're in jail for the double digits time, and you're replaying the events of your life, and somebody said, hey, if you keep going down this road, this is where it's going to be for you. I have to wonder whether or not he was thinking, I should have listened to everybody who said this, even though, as we had read previously, he had purpose in the Spirit to go to Jerusalem, and that was obviously what the Spirit was driving him to do. I still have to think whether or not he thought that. And then, as he had mentioned in just a couple chapters before this, as he had told people, perhaps now he's coming to the realization, I'm going to die here. I'm never going to leave Jerusalem. I'm never going to get a fair trial. This is what's going to happen. I'm going to die here in Jerusalem. Any other thoughts or comments about, yes, either of the Joshes?
Wasn't all this suffering what he was promised?
Yes.
He was told he was going to suffer for.
He was told he was going to suffer, absolutely. And he's getting what he was told in spades. Yes, Josh?
And I feel like several of you guys have also talked about Paul looking a lot like Jesus presented in the Gospels. And Jesus, when he was before the high priest, gave this comment, and then they struck him in the face and said, is that how you answer the high priest? It's like, wait a second. Paul's remembering this is what happened.
This is what happened before.
And I'm going to die here.
Yeah, right. Floyd?
It's kind of a continual theme. We haven't been talking about it a lot, but I'm sure we've all noticed it through the book of Acts, that these aren't random events just haphazardly occurring. These are directed. There is purpose behind them. We see that again and again. Like Paul was told he's going to suffer, that was just pointed out. But like over in Acts 16, don't go into Asia. The Holy Spirit forbade them to go into Asia. And then 3 chapters later, all of Asia is hearing the gospel. The Holy Spirit had a plan. And Paul was told by God, nobody's going to beat you up here in Ephesus. You're going to be successful here.
Right.
And over again, we see God intervening, the Holy Spirit intervening, and it's made obvious by Luke that this is not random events. That this is being directed. All of this is according to God's design.
Right, and I think that's the best transition, because in verse 11, this is what it says. But the following night the Lord stood by him and said, be of good cheer, Paul, for as you have testified of me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness at Rome. It's Jesus himself re-enters the story here. Did you notice that? The Lord himself, not an angel, not a messenger, Jesus himself comes to the barracks and he says, be of good cheer, Paul. You're going to make it to Rome. And how many times in Paul's writings over and over again, there's this phrase, but God. All these circumstances, all these bad things, all these things I can't see, all these things that appear to be totally contrary to what the Spirit's working out, but God then appears into the story. But Jesus then appears into the story and turns everything on its head. And that's what we have here. And I've listed a couple passages that we had time. And so when Paul is undoubtedly at a low point of frustration and anger, and he's surrounded by violence, Jesus appears to turn every conceivable circumstance and outcome Paul could have pictured on its head. Now, we don't have time to go through the rest of this, but there's an assassination attempt that's hatched and is foiled by his nephew. And that assassination attempt is blessed by the very people tasked with upholding the law of God. And I totally missed on the rest of this chapter, so I apologize. But we'll pick up the rest of that in Acts chapter 24 next time. Thanks.
Be thoroughly equipped for every good work. He hadn't left us without direction. May we fill ourselves up and may we rest in peace in his word. Thank you so much for your kind attention.